to the 2013 Symphonic Winds Travelers Trust High School Band Spring Concert. Thank you for coming. Obviously, the first piece you heard this evening was our national anthem, followed by Russian Sailor's Dance by Glier. That's a piece originally written for a Foreman opera that was one of the early works of the Soviet government commissioned Glier to write that. He wrote it without much thought for the politics involved, although it is about workers in a Chinese port who are abused by their masters and revolt against them, and it has some good themes there. But he was more concerned with the music, and it is not famous for its content or its politicism. It's famous for the Russian Sailor's Dance, which he takes traditional Russian folk music concepts there, and you heard just now would be fast paced. It's in theme and variations, so you can hear the same theme repeatedly, but then you hear variations on it. Going to completely change moods now and go to something that many of you have probably heard before, although you may not recognize it by its name. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was one of the premier composers of the classical era and really of world music. He was a writer and composer during the classical era, which spans our colonial times in the 17th and into early 1800s. But then he was also very romantic era in his writing. He was considered one of the first romantic writers, even though he did not work in that era. This piece is reminiscent of the early classical period. Mozart's Marriage of Figaro is an opera. It's an opera buffo, which is a classical and Baroque term for a funny opera, a comic opera. And this is a follow-up opera to the Barber of Seville, and is about a day of chaos in the house of one of the lords. The overture itself is fairly straightforward in its writing. You will probably have heard it before, perhaps in an automobile cartoon or an advertisement, but most likely in a Warner Brothers Bugs Bunny cartoon. So this is Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. quite a challenge for them, and I passed that out earlier in the year. To play Mozart is a challenge. To play it properly is incredibly demanding. And I had to make them rethink their concept of things like accents, crescendos, how they should be done. Very light playing, an accent that isn't hammered like a marching band chord, but is lightly touched on and then used with the breath. And a lot of little details that I won't bore you with, but I have to say I'm really, really proud of the work they put in to achieve that. If it sounded like it wasn't as difficult as it really is, even more so the credit to the students, because it really is very hard, and they did a great job. Moving on, As All the Heavens Were a Bell by J. Bill Cook, our own Travelers Rest former conductor, and now one of the conductors at Furman University, Director of Athletic Bands and Associate Director of Bands. Mr. Bill Cook wrote this as a commission piece, and it does not indicate it in the title, but it is based on the thematic chord progressions and the melody from My Country 'Tis of Thee. You'll notice that the words are printed in your program. I hope nobody's insulted, because I'm pretty sure you guys know the words anyway, but if you'll all hold them up, then nobody will know. I'm going to invite you at the end of this piece to join us in a little sing-along. And I also promise if everyone will join in, no one will know. Okay? You'll hear it. The band will be playing the theme. I'm going to turn around. I'm going to bring you in. You know the melody. You know the words. Please just go ahead and belt it out. I always like to put something patriotic in my spring concert. And this is that piece. You'll notice at the very end, a couple of the words get a little bit longer. If you'll watch me, I'll get you through it. It'll be just fine. All right, let's go with As All the Heavens Were a Bell. warmed up, got a little addition to our program that's not in your program. Last June, I had a meeting where I sat down with the rest of the Fine Arts Department and many administrators in the school, the athletic department, and a lot of us that have a stake in the scheduling of the school and the auditorium. And I realized partway through that meeting that I was going to have to schedule my spring concert on my wife's birthday. She's been very good about that. And I told her I would probably mention it, but she did not know I was going to do this, so I'm not going to throw it later, but it's okay, I'm going to do it anyway. So, if you will join us, please. Where is Smiley? Do stand. Thank you. And we're going to play Happy Birthday, and I invite you to please sing along. There's a short introduction. You know the song. Thank you for indulging. And you should see me running across the parking lot later. Maybe you could all get in front of my wife and wish her happy birthday again. So I can magically get away. Not that I know where I can go. I have to go home sometime. Moving on. I always like to program something. I like to use the word lush and expressive in our concerts. And this particular arrangement, this particular piece is dear to me. Frank Kelly is one of the masters of modern American band writing. And his setting of this is just incredibly well done, very thoughtful and very tasteful. I'd like to actually share some of his words. I wanted my setting of Amazing Grace to reflect the powerful simplicity of the words and melody, to be sincere, to be direct, to be honest, and not through the use of novel harmonies and clever tricks, but by traveling traditional paths in search of truth and authenticity. I believe that music has the power to take us to a place that words alone cannot. And so my own feelings about Amazing Grace reside in this setting itself. The harmony, texture, orchestration, and form are inseparable, intertwined so as to be perceived as a single expressive entity. I think that's as well as I could possibly have put it, probably better. In many ways, this has been a tough year. We've had tragedies all over the country, all over the world, both recent in Oklahoma and in the not too distant past in Pennsylvania, and in many other places. And rather than select any one single thing, I'd like to dedicate this performance of this piece to everyone, everywhere. People that are dealing with tragedy, people who are not, people who may one day, people who have and have come through it, everyone sitting on the stage and everyone in this audience.